But basically, in this essay set, you have experiments from both sociology and psychology. So let's differentiate what's the difference between the two. Sociology is the study of group interaction, how different groups of individuals behave. Psychology is more about the individual, about the individual's response and kind of that inner monologue that goes on inside your head. Well, what's happening here with these three essays is kind of the merging of the two. So these are social psychology essays. In other words, looking at the individual and collective psychology that develops within groups of people. So that's the question that these essays attempt to address, is to what degree will individuals conform when they know that what they're doing violates what is right, what is ethical, what is moral, and kind of what factors come to bear upon that. So each individual design of these experiments is designed to test a different kind of theory along those lines. So Ash kind of provides us with a baseline for that. Now, think about 1950s. What in world history has just happened if you're a social psychologist doing research in the 1950s? What major world event is just finished? World War II. So you're on the other side of World War II, the atrocities that were committed in Europe during that time period, and there were some good, well-meaning people who were led astray because of some of the very things that Solomon Asch is experimenting on. So people who would torture and kill other people and say, well, I was just following orders. Even if it violated their conscience, even if it violated their sense of morality, they were just following orders. And so we're looking at the degree to which someone would obey authority, even when it violates their sense of right and wrong. So if you look at Solomon Asch's essay, it begins at the top of page 352. Basically, the first 7 paragraphs constitute the introduction. So I want to walk through some of the things that happen in the first 7 paragraphs. Paragraph 2, the first question: how and to what extent do social forces constrain people's opinions and attitudes? So that is the question that he is attempting to answer in this experiment. Now, keep in mind, this was written in the 1950s. How is this perhaps even more applicable today? Are people prone to the engineering of consent? Are people prone to being made to think or do certain things without fully examining it themselves? Absolutely. We see evidence of it from this past summer, and where we see people receiving news and information from very slanted sources. So if someone is a conservative, they may only draw information from one source. Is that one source completely and 100% accurate, fair, balanced? Probably not. Same could be said for liberals who perhaps are getting just one little piece of information from a source. What we need to be aware of as good citizens and as good students is that we need to look at a lot of different eclectic sources and then draw our own opinions from that. I heard a statement not too long ago, is that the news used to tell us what happened and we determined how we felt about it. But now the news tells us how we feel about things, and then we have to determine whether or not it happened. Pretty powerful statement, isn't it? Kind of the change of how, as American citizens, as global citizens, we receive news and information and we determine our opinions about it. So all the way back in the 1950s, Solomon Asch is kind of determining how do people form their opinions and what's the effect of the majority, what does that have on people's opinions. He talks about this idea right here of unprecedented technical extension of communication. Again, he's writing in the 1950s, and he's talking about the effect of technology as that applies to engineering consent. It pales in comparison to the kind of technology that we have today for communication. So again, I think it's only underscored today the extent to which we communicate. And then he says this idea of engineering of consent. What does that phrase mean? Engineering of consent. It's used right there in paragraph 2. Say it louder. Absolutely. It's manipulation. How do people manipulate others by engineering consent? How does that happen? Give me some examples from recent history of the engineering of consent. Okay, so give me an example from the election.
Like everybody just takes like anything someone says and they run with it.
Okay.
And like one person believes it, so they think that, or like whoever their political leader is, they just take it for like the word of God, basically.
There you go. So taking someone's opinion about something without examining the evidence could be engineering of consent. Think back to the 2016 election and all those Facebook ads that suggested corruption. And people believe some of those things, and they've been proven to be patently false. But there's a good number of Americans who still staunchly believe that some of those claims were legitimate. That's the engineering of consent. How dangerous is that? That's fairly dangerous because someone with enough clout can manipulate and engineer consent until you get a completely skewed view of reality. And so that has caused a lot of problems in this country, not just politically around the election, but also socially around issues of race. That has become a hotbed where certain individuals or certain groups have a slanted view of something and they promote that through this extensive use of technology for communication that we see today, primarily through social media platforms. And so they can engineer consent, and it may not always be the correct thing or based on true and accurate information. So I think this essay really has some good applications and some reason for us to take pause and think given what we see today. Paragraph 3, he makes reference to Charcot and Sigmund Freud. Okay, so these are some physicians, and Sigmund Freud is a psychoanalyst. What do you know about Sigmund Freud? What did he study? He did it in the 1920s, and what were some of the theories that he came up with? Any of you had a psychology class yet?
Yeah.
You probably studied Freud a little bit. What do you know about him? He did a lot with dream analysis, where he looked at the subconscious mind and how what manifests itself in dreams at night is how your subconscious is processing things that have happened during the day. He was the first to come up with that idea of the subconscious mind and dreams as a way of processing those things. That's why when you have dreams, sometimes there will be people in your dreams that have absolutely no connection to one another, but they show up in the same dream. That's your subconscious mind trying to process something about those individuals, and generally you can trace it back to something that happened the day before. So, like, there was something that prompted that to be in your subconscious mind, and your dream is a way of analyzing that. You don't remember most of the dreams that you have. Unless you wake up, you're not going to remember the dreams that you have during deep sleep. But if you wake up in the middle of the night, chances are you're going to remember a dream. If you wake up in the middle of a dream, chances are you're going to remember that. It's your subconscious mind kind of processing and dealing with all of the overload of information. Sigmund Freud came up with that theory. He also came up with the idea of the Oedipal complex, that young boys go through a stage in their development of wanting to replace their father and be with their mother. So he had some very sexually oriented theories about human growth and development. If you take a psychology class in child development, you will study Sigmund Freud pretty thoroughly, pretty extensively. And then there's this one phrase down here, and I wondered if anybody took the time to look this up. In paragraph 4, he says, social man, and this is a quote, is a somnambulist. Does anybody know what the word somnambulist is? Anybody take the time to look that up? It means a sleepwalker. A somnambulist is a sleepwalker. So knowing that, how does that apply to the introduction of this essay? Social man is a sleepwalker. When you sleepwalk, are you fully processing and aware of what's going on? You're just going through the motions. So that's pretty telling here in what he says, that in society, we're just kind of going through the motions and we're being influenced by all of these different things around us, and we really aren't thinking or reacting to our environment. We're just sleepwalkers. So I thought that was a fairly telling sort of statement. Then paragraph 8 really is the body of this essay, where he begins to talk about the social design of the experiment. And so basically the experiment is you're given a line on one card, and from lines 1, 2, and 3, which one is most near it? The answer is obvious. That line is the same line as number 2. But if you're in a room of 10 people and 10 people are consistently giving the correct answer, this is an easy test. Everybody can see it, obviously. But then at some point, everybody in the room, 9 people in the room, are in on the joke, so to speak, and they begin giving the wrong answer. And so the subject is the one person who's not been told beforehand. And so if 9 people before you all say that line is most near the length of number 1, what's the likelihood that you're going to look at that and say, well, I know it's number 2, but if everyone else says that it's number 1, it must be number 1, and then report that it's number 1. Has it ever happened to you before, like in a math class? Everybody's giving the same answer, but it's the wrong answer, and you know it, but you say, I must be the one who's wrong, right? It's not just about math and numbers and lines, but it's about just things in general. If the whole group is going with the wrong decision, do you have the individuality of character to stand up and say, no, that's not right. That's not the right answer, or that's not the right course of action. That's what this experiment is looking at. Then there are variations of, does the size of the group affect one's response? Does the discrepancy in the answer affect someone's response? And so he fleshes all that out in the body paragraphs. The conclusion that truly gives us kind of the so what of this is paragraph 29. If you didn't make it to paragraph 29, you need to be sure you go back and read paragraph 29, because this tells us the so what. What does all of this mean? And then paragraph 30 is kind of like a little qualifier statement that's placed on that. Let's work through the questions that you did yesterday, the review questions 1 through 4, and then we'll look at the discussion questions for today. Here's number 1. What is suggestibility, and how is this phenomenon related to social pressure? Suggestibility is mentioned in the introduction in paragraph 3. It's in the discussion of hypnosis. Hypnosis was but an extreme form of a normal psychological process which became known as suggestibility. So what is suggestibility? What is hypnosis? Yeah, kind of like brainwashing, when someone's put into some sort of trance and this information is repeated and reiterated over and over again, and it causes these involuntarily prompted bodily changes or reactions. For example, if I ring a bell, you're going to crow like a rooster. And you snap out of it, you ring a bell, and that person has an involuntary reaction. They begin crowing. That's hypnosis. By the way, they originally thought that the only people who could undergo hypnosis were hysterical patients. What does it mean to be hysterical? Yes, synonymous with crazy, but do you know where it originally originated? What word does hysteria look like? Hysterectomy, which is what? You were right. You're not going to like this. Yeah, has to do with women. So if a woman has a hysterectomy, it means that she's had all of her female organs removed. That, by the way, changes your chemistry, right? It changes your hormones. They believed, and hysteria was a mental condition that was assigned to women who were undergoing menopause. So they believed that only women who were going through menopause or had a hysterectomy were capable of this hysteria. So women, you probably don't like that theory, probably don't like that answer, but that was what social psychologists believe about women. Now, suggestibility then, to answer this question, occurs when there's repetition of instruction, repetition of information that produces an involuntary change in people. How's that related to social pressure? The more you are bombarded with information, the more likely you are to succumb to it. That's why your parents, your teachers, your preachers, your Sunday school teachers have talked to you for years about peer pressure. And you may have dismissed it as I can stand up to peer pressure. Be careful about that. Peer pressure is real, and peer pressure probably impacts you more than you actually realize. It is really hard to stand up against the group. Peer pressure is not just something that teenagers experience. Peer pressure occurs when you're an adult as well. When you get into a profession as an adult, you will be subjected to a certain degree of peer pressure to behave in certain ways. It never goes away. Your ability to react to it will change, but it's always there in the background. Question number 2 says, summarize the procedure and results of the ASH experiment. What conclusions does ASH draw from these results? So this is where you're going to describe how that subjects are presented with a line. They must choose which line that it most nearly resembles. The subject of the experiment isn't in on the information that people are going to be giving the wrong answer on purpose. And so the study is to determine, will the person give the wrong answer just because everybody else gave the wrong answer? And what were the results? What did he find? In the majority of cases, what do people do? They give the wrong answer. They go along with the group, even though it's obvious what the right answer is. It's that fear of being alienated, being separated from the crowd. It's the fear of being wrong. Fear of maybe I'm the one who I'm not seeing it correctly and everyone else is seeing it correctly, so I'm going to go along with the crowd. Three says, to what extent did varying the size of the majority and its unanimity affect the experimental results? If there were more people who were giving the wrong answer, it increased the likelihood that the subject would give the wrong answer. So size of the crowd matters. And if the dissenting crowd is in the majority, that increased the likelihood that the person would give the wrong answer. And then question number 4 is really answered in paragraph 29. That's why I said that's an important paragraph. It says, what distinction does ASH draw between consensus and conformity? Paragraph 29. Life in society requires consensus as an indispensable condition. But consensus, to be productive, requires that each individual contribute independently out of his experience and insight. What is consensus? Group agreement. Does everyone get their way in consensus? Not exactly. So in order to achieve consensus, what do individuals have to do? So there has to be some degree of compromise. So if we're trying to decide something in this class, if we're trying to decide, are we going to have a test on Thursday or are we going to have it on Friday? And half of you say Thursday, half of you say Friday, then somebody's not going to get their way. And the consensus is going to be developing a solution that we can all agree upon, even if it wasn't the solution that we started out with. That's consensus. ASH says society needs consensus. Think about Congress. Think about the Senate. What are they supposed to do? Make laws for this country. What process should be used in achieving that? Consensus building. There should be some degree of that. Do we always have consensus building in Congress? No. We have people advocating for their way or the highway. Now, the other part of this is conformity. When consensus comes under the dominance of conformity, the social process is polluted, and the individual at the same time surrenders the powers on which his functioning as a feeling and thinking being depends. What is Conformity.
Giving, like you're no longer giving your opinion on whatever the matter is.
So conformity is giving in, conforming to the rest of the crowd. So consensus, he says, is necessary for society, and it requires that individuals think independently and contribute independently. And there's this give and take of building consensus. But conformity is when the majority just powers through and everyone has to conform to what the majority says. In the grand scheme of things, what's the purpose of education? And why is it important to a democracy?
Because you're not smart, you can't think.
If you're not smart, you can't think. So for the past 13 years, we've attempted to teach you how to think. In the process, we've taught you how to conform, right? We've taught you how to sit in rows, how to behave, how to keep your opinions to yourself when they're contradictory to someone else's, right? We do a really good job of making you conform while at the same time trying to get you to be thinkers. The real process of education is to produce an independent citizen. It matters not what you end up doing in society as far as making a living. What matters is that you're a good citizen and you contribute to the community that you live in. That's the ultimate aim of education, is to get you to a point where you can be a productive citizen and contribute and think independently. And sometimes we lose sight of that goal. But that ultimately is why education is necessary for a democracy. If you live in a government that's not a democracy, do you really have to educate your citizens? No. So if you have a dictatorship, there's really no need for education because it would be contradictory to what the dictatorship would want because you want to have conformity. And if you don't have education, then you're not likely to rise up and rebel. Why did slave owners not teach their slaves how to read and write? Same reason, right? Because if you can read and write, you can think independently and you can communicate and you can incite rebellion. Incidentally, that's how the Underground Railroad developed. Because people like Frederick Douglass, who learned independently how to read and write, learned how to communicate with other slaves. And because of that, they developed that network of sources that we call the Underground Railroad. All right, for today's assignment, we're moving into the discussion and writing suggestions. These are a little bit more in-depth and may require your answers to be a little bit more sophisticated than just the review questions. There are 5 of these. We'll quickly preview them and then I'll give you some time to write and submit that. It says, before discussing the experiment, Ash considers how easily people's opinions or attitudes may be shaped by social pressure. To what extent do you agree with this conclusion? Write a short paper on this subject, drawing upon examples from your own experience or observations or from your reading. You do not have to write a paper in response to this. This can be a couple of sentences, but keep in mind you'll go back to this and look at it as pre-writing for the essay that you write based on this set of essays. So this is asking you to agree or disagree with what Solomon says about the engineering of consent, about suggestibility, about the pressures that a crowd will exert on someone. Do that in about a couple of sentences. You've got an answer for number 1. Number 2, do the results of this experiment surprise you, or do they confirm facts about human behavior that you already suspected, observed, or experienced? Explain in 2 or 3 paragraphs, provide examples relating these. Again, 2 or 3 sentences. I'm just asking you to do a short answer here. But were you surprised that people will give the wrong answer just because the rest of the group is giving the wrong answer? Does that surprise you? What has your experience been in terms of peer pressure, or where have you witnessed this? Number 3, frequently the conclusions drawn from a researcher's experimental results are challenged on the basis that laboratory conditions do not accurately reflect the complexity of human behavior. Ash draws certain conclusions about the degree to which individuals are affected by group pressures based on an experiment involving subjects choosing matching line lengths. To what extent, if any, do you believe that these conclusions lack validity because the behavior at the heart of the experiment is too dissimilar to real life situations of group pressure on the individual. Support your opinions with examples. So for number 3, it's asking you to consider, is this real to life? Is this contrived laboratory experiment, typically done with college students, is that an accurate reflection to what happens in real life? Yay or nay, give some examples. Number 4, we are all familiar with the phenomenon of peer pressure. To what extent do Ash's experiments demonstrate the power of peer pressure? To what extent do you think that other factors may be at work? Again, 1 or 2 sentences to answer number 4. And then number 5, Ash's experiments conducted in the early 1950s involved groups of 7 to 9 young men, all college students. To what extent do you believe that the results of a similar experiment would be different today? To what extent might they be different if the subjects had included women, as well as and subjects of various ages, from children to middle-aged people to older people? To what extent do you believe that the social class or culture of the subjects might have an impact upon the experimental results? Don't overgeneralize on that one. So if you were to conduct this with a group of older people, do you think they would be more likely to buck the trend, or do you think that they would be equally subjected to social pressure? It's an interesting question to consider. So a couple of sentences on each of those, and you'll submit those as your assignment for today.